There are moments when a person becomes the subject of considerable interest in Crimsbury. This appeared to be one of them. Outside the Fog and Finch stood a remarkably large gathering of young ladies. Some carried music books. Several carried violin cases. They whispered excitedly amongst themselves. No one seemed especially interested in the tea shop. Mildred watched them through the window. "Doris, why are there so many young ladies outside?" Doris glanced toward the window. "I imagine they are waiting for someone." Mildred watched another girl join the queue. "My goodness, how many are there?" Doris counted silently, then stopped and said, "I've lost track." Just then, the bell above the door jingled. In strode Mr. Albert Pemberly with his customary energy, removing his top hat with one hand while greeting everyone in sight with the other. "Good morning." He noticed the gathering outside. "My word!" He peered through the window. "We're either expecting royalty," he paused with a playful wink, "or someone considerably younger." It had been only a few weeks since Mr. Elias Songwood arrived in Crimsbury, yet it was already becoming rather difficult to remember the village without him. Most mornings, he could be seen crossing the square with a leather music case. He always tipped his hat and smiled, yet he rather looked as though he were quietly listening to something the rest of us could not quite hear. Personally, I suspected music kept him company even when the world was perfectly silent. Mr. Songwood appeared around the corner, carrying his familiar music case. He tipped his hat politely toward the little gathering. "Good morning." Every young lady answered at exactly the same moment. "Good morning, Mr. Songwood." Poor Mr. Songwood looked genuinely surprised. One brave young lady stepped forward. "Mr. Songwood, my mother wondered if you might possibly have room for another piano pupil." Immediately another spoke. "My aunt hoped I might inquire as well." "And my grandmother," added a third, "is quite certain I possess hidden musical gifts." Mr. Pemberly leaned ever so slightly toward Doris. "I suspect musical gifts are not the only thing drawing such remarkable interest." Doris smiled into her teacup. "I believe you're right." Mr. Songwood, however, seemed entirely unaware of any unusual excitement. "I should be delighted to meet each of you." He smiled with his usual kindness. "Personally, I have often observed that the people who attract the greatest admiration are usually the very last to notice it themselves." Before long, Mr. Songwood was making his way down the lane with a cheerful little procession of hopeful pupils following behind him. Mildred watched from the window and said, "My goodness! It appears half the village has suddenly decided to learn the piano." Doris smiled warmly. "I rather think they'll learn far more than that." Doris watched the little group disappear around the corner. "I don't believe Mr. Songwood merely teaches music. I believe he teaches courage." At the time, none of us yet realized how much of his own he was still searching for. It was not long before Mr. Songwood's little music room became one of the busiest places in Crimsbury. Children arrived carrying music books nearly as large as themselves. Parents carried hopes even larger. Some gathered at the piano. Others came with violins tucked beneath their chins. Each seemed quietly convinced that everyone else had been born knowing how to play. Fortunately, Mr. Songwood was never in much of a hurry. He understood that music, much like friendship, could not be forced, only encouraged. A little boy named Thomas frowned at the page. "I keep missing that note." Mr. Songwood smiled. "Perhaps the note is waiting for us to become acquainted." Thomas laughed. "I don't think notes can wait. I've met a great many that do." Thomas tried again. This time, he found it. "There you are," Elias said warmly. "I knew it hadn't wandered very far." The little boy grinned. Later that morning, a young girl carefully placed her hands upon the piano keys. Her name was Clara. She was earnest, careful, and worried about almost everything. She played the opening measure beautifully, then stopped. "Oh dear, I wasn't quite right." Mr. Songwood smiled. "Must you begin again?" Clara looked surprised. "I thought that's what musicians always do." "I think," he said gently, "musicians keep going." She hesitated. "But what if someone hears the mistake?" Mr. Songwood's expression softened. "My dear Miss Clara, even the finest musicians miss a note now and then." She blinked. "And what do? They find the next one." Clara smiled. "I suppose the music forgives them." "I believe it does." She took a slow breath and played the passage again. Not perfectly, but with noticeably more courage. As the weeks passed, Mr. Songwood's little music room became filled with something far lovelier than perfect scales: confidence. Children left each lesson standing a little taller than when they arrived, not because they played every note correctly, but because they were learning that mistakes were not nearly as frightening as they seemed. That, I believe, is a lesson that serves one well long after the music has ended. One bright afternoon, Clara climbed onto the piano bench. "I've been practicing every day," she announced. "I suspected as much," Elias replied. "Your music looks considerably less surprised to see you." She giggled. "I still become nervous." He smiled. "That's perfectly all right. The trick isn't waiting until you're no longer frightened. It's discovering that courage usually arrives a moment or two later." Clara considered this and said, "I think I'd like to meet courage." "I believe you already have." She looked puzzled. "You came to your lesson today, didn't you?" Elias said. A slow smile appeared on her face as she nodded. He said, "Then I'd say courage is already sitting beside you on the piano bench." Personally, I thought that was a remarkably comfortable place for courage to sit. Clara began to play. A note stumbled. She paused and looked at Elias. He simply smiled and gave the tiniest nod. She took a breath and continued. By the final chord, she was smiling. "Very good," Elias said. "Now, shall we have another go?" "I thought you'd say that." Clara laughed. After the last lesson of the afternoon, Mr. Songwood decided to take a stroll through the park. Crimsbury had a little stone bridge that crossed the narrow stream as it wound through the park. The water moved quietly beneath the old stone arches, and on particularly peaceful afternoons, a white swan could sometimes be found gliding along its surface. One happened to be there that very afternoon. For several moments, Mr. Songwood simply stood watching it. Then a familiar voice called from the bridge. Mr. Songwood, he toned. Mr. and Mrs. Pemberly were approaching from the other side. Albert lifted his hat with his usual enthusiasm. Good afternoon, my boy. Emily smiled warmly. We were just discussing you. Mr. Songwood raised an eyebrow. Should I be concerned? Emily smiled and said, Not at all. We were talking about the children. Her face brightened. They've been working so hard. I do hope you'll allow them to play something at the autumn musical. Albert nodded vigorously. I've persuaded the committee to hold one next Saturday. Nothing terribly grand, he assured them. Emily gave him a look. Albert paused. Well, perhaps slightly grand. I have noticed that Mrs. Pemberly possesses a remarkable ability to turn Mr. Albert Pemberley's enthusiasm towards something resembling practicality. She smiled at Elias. I think it would be wonderful for the children. So do I, he replied. They've come such a long way. Emily looked toward the park. Music does that. She paused. It gives people somewhere to put what they cannot quite say. Mr. Songwood was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. I think you're right. Albert rested an arm affectionately around his wife's shoulders. Well then, it's settled. Music, children, biscuits. He glanced at Emily. Emily laughed. Come along, Albert. They began walking toward the village together. Elias remained on the bridge for another moment. Below him, the white swan moved slowly through the reeds, leaving only the faintest ripple behind. Then he continued home. Personally, I think some of the happiest moments in life are the quiet ones. No applause, no audience. Just a beautiful afternoon, and the pleasant feeling that something good is beginning. The following Saturday arrived bright and clear. By 1:30, the little chapel was wonderfully full. Parents straightened collars, smoothed dresses, and attempted to tame a few particularly unruly heads of hair. Small musicians practiced imaginary scales upon their knees. Personally, I have always believed the moments before a performance are considerably louder inside one's head than anywhere else. Before long, every pew was filled. Doris and Mildred had secured 2 of the very best seats. I do hope the children aren't too nervous, Mildred whispered. I imagine they are, Doris replied. At the piano, Elias greeted each pupil with a quiet smile, offered an encouraging word, and reminded more than one trembling child to take a slow breath. Mrs. Pemberly moved among the children with equal warmth. You're going to do beautifully. One little girl was already close to tears. But what if I miss a note? Mrs. Pemberly took both her hands and smiled gently. Then you smile and keep going. The little girl looked at her uncertainly. Even if everyone hears. Especially then. A tiny smile appeared. Remember, Mr. Songwood taught you how to play. Today, you simply get to share it. Personally, I thought that was excellent advice. At last, the music began. One by one, the children played. Some were polished, some were hesitant, but every performance was greeted with warm applause. Then it was Clara's turn. She walked carefully to the piano, sat very straight, smoothed her dress, and took one long, quiet breath. Mr. Songwood gave her the smallest nod, the kind that says, I believe in you, She began beautifully. The first few measures floated gently through the chapel. Then, as she turned the page, the music slipped. The sheets fluttered from the stand, scattered beneath the piano, and came to rest in a rather untidy heap. The chapel went very still. Poor Clara froze. Her hands hovered above the keys. Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Mr. Songwood did not sigh. He did not look disappointed. He simply knelt, gathered the scattered pages, and placed them carefully back upon the stand. Then he smiled. "My dear Miss Clara, I believe your music has decided to take a little walk." For one heartbeat, Clara simply stared at him. Then a tiny laugh escaped, just enough to loosen the fear. Mr. Songwood smiled. "There we are." Clara took another breath. This time, she smiled, and when she began again, her hands trembled a little less. "Personally, I have noticed that courage rarely arrives all at once. More often, it slips quietly into the empty place where fear has just begun to leave." When the final notes faded, the little chapel filled with applause. Not the sort reserved for great concert halls, but the warmer kind. The kind that says, "You were brave." Personally, I think that is the finest sort of applause there is. Soon, the piano was closed, teacups were filled, and every available plate held something delicious. Humans do seem remarkably gifted at celebrating with baked goods. Clara, however, was still troubled. She sat in her mother's lap, twisting her handkerchief between her fingers. "I spoiled it," she whispered. Her father smiled gently beside her. Just then, Mr. Albert Pemberly wandered over. "My dear, do you know how many notes I missed today?" Clara looked up. "But you weren't playing." He nodded solemnly. "Exactly. I find that the safest approach." A tiny laugh escaped her. Albert smiled. "Besides, I wasn't listening for mistakes. I was watching a young lady who found the courage to begin again." Clara looked at him. "Do you really think so?" "My dear, I know so." She took a biscuit, and little by little, her smile returned. Across the room, Mr. Songwood watched quietly. He simply smiled. Perhaps, seeing one frightened child begin to believe in herself was reward enough. By the time the last teacup had been returned to its saucer, the little chapel had grown quiet again. Parents gathered coats. Children chatted excitedly about missed notes, wrong pages, and who had received the loudest applause. Clara was laughing now. That was perhaps my favorite sound of the afternoon. When the last child had gone, Elias closed the piano and rested one hand upon it. For a moment, he simply listened, not to the music, to the silence between the notes. Then he stepped outside. The late afternoon light stretched across the churchyard. Beyond the old stone wall, dark clouds were beginning to gather over the village. Elias followed the path toward the brook. He had just reached the old bridge when a familiar voice called behind him. "You looked rather pleased with yourself today." Elias turned and saw Silas Weatherby with his usual friendly smile. "I did not," Elias replied with a small chuckle. For a while, neither man spoke. The wind moved through the trees. Elias watched the water beneath the bridge. He looked tired, more than tired. Silas noticed but did not ask why. He simply stood beside him. After a moment, Silas said quietly, "You are happy today." Elias looked at him. The children were. Silas said nothing. Elias looked back toward the water and watched the swan peacefully gliding along. Then Elias heard it. A soft, steady ticking. He turned toward the village. The metronome. Silas watched him. Elias listened. "What is that?" The ticking continued. "You don't hear that?" Silas shook his head. "No." Elias closed his eyes, and for a long moment he stood perfectly still. Silas looked at him and said, "Elias?" Silas seemed about to say something. Instead, he simply said, "Come on." Elias opened his eyes. "Where?" Silas nodded toward the village. "Home." Elias looked at the darkening sky. For a moment, he remained on the bridge. Then he followed.